Hello, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why, and how of newspaper reading. Today, we are going to discuss the important issues appearing in the New Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 30th May 2019. The news to be discussed has been presented on the screen, and timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. So, let's start our today's discussion. The first news appears in the editorial section on page number 10. It says, The Second Coming, the invitation list for swearing in signals Modi government's foreign policy focus. Now, this editorial highlights India's invitation to foreign dignitaries and leaders of multilateral institutions at the swearing in ceremony of the Prime Minister and his Council of Ministers. So, the Prime Minister in his swearing in ceremony has invited leaders of BIMSTEC, where BIMSTEC stands for Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation. Now, BIMSTEC is a regional organization comprising of 7 member states or 7 countries which lies in the littoral and adjacent areas of the Bay of Bengal. And this regional organization, that is BIMSTEC, came into being on 6th June 1997 through the Bangkok Declaration. Further, the Prime Minister has also invited the chairperson of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Suronbay Jeenbekov of Kyrgyzstan. Now, another invitee on the list is Prime Minister of Mauritius, Mr. Pravin Jugnauth. So, invitation to leaders of BIMSTEC, chairperson of SCO, and Prime Minister of Mauritius signals government's foreign policy focus. Now, in your prelims, this topic forms a part of current events of national and international importance, and your mains gets covered under GS Paper 2 under International Relations, specifically with respect to India and its neighborhood relations, and bilateral, regional, and global groupings and agreements involving India or affecting India's interests. Now, the importance of this particular editorial can be seen from these different questions asked in previous UPSC mains examination in GS paper 2. Now, this particular question was asked in the year 2015. The question was, Indian diaspora has an important role to play in Southeast Asian countries, economy and society. Appraise the role of Indian diaspora in Southeast Asia in this context. So we understand that India's relation with Southeast Asian nations, both politically as well as economically, becomes extremely significant. And you can see that different questions have been asked by UPSC with respect to Southeast Asia. Now, these two questions were asked in the year 2016 in GS paper 2. First was with respect to SAARC, and the second was with respect to Look East policy. The first question read, Increasing cross-border terrorist attacks in India and growing interference in internal affairs of several member states by Pakistan are not conducive for the future of SAARC. Explain with suitable examples. Now, we have witnessed the deteriorating relation between India and Pakistan, especially after the terrorist attacks. So, in this backdrop, again this question becomes important, and the relevance of SAARC is again questioned, as the Prime Minister of India Narendra Modi has not invited specifically Pakistan in the swearing in ceremony. The next question says, Evaluate the economic and strategic dimensions of India's Look East policy in the context of post-Cold War international scenario. So we can see that Southeast Asia as well as Look East policy as a foreign policy imperative of the Indian government becomes important. And hence, in this note, it will be important to see how India further nurture its relation with the BIMSTEC members. Another important aspect to be highlighted is that India has not invited leaders of Pakistan, Afghanistan as well as Maldives. Now, by not inviting leaders of Pakistan, Afghanistan and Maldives, the government has signaled that its regional preferences have now shifted from SAARC to that of BIMSTEC. Further, in 2014, the Prime Minister of Pakistan Nawaz Sharif was invited with a hope to improve bilateral relations. However, incidents of terror attacks and deteriorating relations with Pakistan, especially post Pulwama, has signaled that Prime Minister of India Narendra Modi does not have the same hope and faith in Pakistan he had in the year 2014 when he took oath as a Prime Minister for the first time. So all these highlights the shifting of India's preferences from SAARC to that of BIMSTEC. Now, as you can see in this picture, these are the different members of ASEAN, BIMSTEC, and Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Now, Thailand is a BIMSTEC member as well as a member of ASEAN, that is Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and Thailand currently holds the chair of ASEAN 2019. So, this invitation of BIMSTEC members, including Thailand, confirms India's Act East initiative and also signals an outreach to East Asian nations. Now, as you can see, the members of Shanghai Cooperation Organization includes Russian Federation, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, India, Pakistan, as well as China. So, this separate invitation of SCO chairperson who is from Kyrgyzstan indicates India's commitment to Central Asian grouping led by China as well as Russia. Now, this also needs to be understood from the perspective that Prime Minister Narendra Modi will be meeting the SCO later in June 2019. Now, invitation of Prime Minister of Mauritius, who visited India as chief guest at Pravasi Bharati Conference in Varanasi in January 2019, also signals growing relation or close affairs between India and Mauritius. So, invitation to these BIMSTEC members, including that of Prime Minister of Mauritius as well as chairperson of SCO, signals India's changing stance with respect to its foreign policy initiative. So, on this note, let us understand India's hopes and concerns specifically with respect to BIMSTEC, SCO, as well as ASEAN. Now, despite BIMSTEC's recent failures, India still sees BIMSTEC as a possible alternative to SAARC. In the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, which was held in Astana, which is the capital of Kazakhstan in 2017, it granted India and Pakistan status of a full member. So now, India is a full member at Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and at this forum, role of India will become even more important and significant. Now, entry of India in SCO is primarily seen as that of a balancer. As you can see, the SCO, that is Shanghai Cooperation Organization, has China as well as Russia. However, sanctions on Iran, Venezuela, and Russia by the United States pose a significant challenge and concern for India, considering the fact that India maintains a good relations specifically with respect to Iran and Russia, both on economic terms as well as politically. So, the invitation of foreign dignitaries, including that of BIMSTEC, the Prime Minister of Mauritius, and the chairperson of SCO, shows India's roadmap for the future with respect to multilateral engagements. So, we understand that this topic becomes extremely important from a mains perspective. With this, let's move on to our next news discussion. Now, the next news also appears on page number 10 as a lead article. This article talks about breaking out of the middle growth orbit. The second Modi government faces a challenging economic agenda and it must back key reforms. Now, this particular article highlights about various steps which must be taken by the new government formed by Prime Minister Narendra Modi in order to revive the economic slowdown in India. So, primarily, this article highlights about how to counter NBFC crisis, that is non-banking financial companies crisis. It further highlights how to boost consumption expenditure, and then it mentions the need to streamline GST, that is goods and services tax. Now, in prelims examination, this topic becomes a part of Indian economy, and your mains it gets covered under GS paper 3. Now, before understanding the crisis of NBFC, let us first of all understand how NBFC generally works. Now, these non-banking financial companies, unlike banks, do not get deposits from customers. So, they have to depend on other sources with respect to generating revenue or generating finance. So, the other sources of revenue on which these NBFCs depend are banks, corporate bonds, and commercial papers. Now, corporate bonds is generally issued for a long-term period or a period of more than 1 year, whereas commercial papers are issued for a period of less than 1 year. So, most of these NBFCs, including ILNFS, raises money through these commercial papers, which are a short-term loan or which are offered on a period of less than 1 year. So mostly these NBFCs raises money through short-term financial instruments like commercial paper. And after raising these revenue from short-term financial instruments, they invest in long-term infrastructural projects. As gestation period for these infrastructure projects is roughly around 15 to 20 years. Now, gestation period here means that it is only after 15 to 20 years these infrastructure projects will start to give back return. However, NBFCs have raised money to fund these infrastructure projects, which are long term projects, through a short term borrowing. Hence, even though these infrastructural projects are not paying back the interest, these NBFCs have to pay back this interest raised through these short term commercial papers. So, this is what has been referred to as asset liability mismatch. That is, the asset is in the longer term, whereas the liability to pay back the interest is in short term. So, this article highlights that India's non-banking financial companies, that is NBFC sector, is affected by a series of default because of the asset liability mismatch. Now, the crisis faced by the NBFC sector is also referred as India's Lehman moment, as it also has a contagion effect. That is, the impact of the NBFC sector also has its exposure to other financial institutions which lend such short term financial instruments to such NBFCs. So, the NBFC crisis has also impacted other financial institutions such as banks, which provides short term as well as long term loans to these NBFCs. Now, so far, the NBFC sector had grown by leaps and bounds and were able to cater to the credit needs of the economy. However, with respect to the recent crisis on account of asset liability mismatch, can also have a contagion effect and can also impact other institutions which have exposure to financial instruments which have been lended to such NBFCs. And this contagion effect may lead to further economic slowdown in the Indian economy. Now, the article in this aspect highlights that the RBI must provide for a separate liquidity window for NBFC sector to cater to their needs. However, RBI so far has refused. So, the article mentions that the new government must work with RBI in order to cater to the needs of NBFC sector in order to limit the contagion effect with respect to the NBFC crisis. Now, another important aspect highlighted in this article is with respect to consumption expenditure. Now, when GDP is calculated through the expenditure method, it includes consumption expenditure, private expenditure, government expenditure, as well as net exports. Now, net exports here refers to export minus import. So, we understand that consumption expenditure becomes a very important part of GDP, that is gross domestic product. And consumption expenditure accounts for 60% of India's GDP. Now, the recent decline in consumption expenditure can be seen with respect to agrarian distress as well as unemployment. And this decline in consumption expenditure has led to slowdown in the Indian economy. Further, decline in consumption expenditure is also quite evident in the decrease in sale of passenger cars and two-wheelers, as this particular sector has witnessed a sharpest drop in the last 8 years. So, this article highlights that in order to improve the consumption expenditure in the Indian economy, the government must cut down or reduce income tax as well as corporate tax. As cut down of income tax and corporate tax will leave more money at the hands of individuals as well as corporations or companies. As more money in the hands of individuals and companies will further lead them to spend more in the Indian economy, and this will effectively increase the demand in the Indian economy. So, the article highlights that cutting down on income tax and corporate tax will fulfill government's dual objective. First, it will increase consumption expenditure, and second, it will also boost or increase the tax GDP ratio. Now, tax GDP ratio refers to a ratio with respect to tax revenue of the government and that of the GDP, that is gross domestic product. Now the concept of tax GDP ratio can be best understood through the Laffer curve. Now Laffer curve shows a relation between percentage of tax rate as well as tax revenue. Now as per this graph, it highlights that if the government keeps on increasing the tax rate, then the revenue of the government might end up declining. Because more the government increases the tax rate, people end up evading taxes. So the tax rate must be fixed at an optimum level so as to maximize the revenue for the government. So it is on this note, this article highlights that the finance minister must cut down both personal tax, that is income tax, as well as the corporate tax. Now in the 2018-19 budget, the finance minister had reduced the corporate tax to 25% for such companies having turnover of less than 250 crore. So this article has recommended that this concession must be extended to other companies as well, as decline in corporate tax will boost investment by the private sector in the Indian economy. So the article highlights that cutting down on income tax as well as corporate tax will help in achieving the government's objective to increase consumption expenditure as well as to boost tax GDP ratio. Now GST was introduced in order to simplify the tax structure and improve tax compliance in economy. However, the existing GST regime has multiple tax rates starting from 0% to that of 28%. So the article in this aspect has recommended to reduce the complexity of tax regime by reducing the different number of tax rates currently applicable with respect to GST regime. Now as of now, roughly around 62% of the goods and services are now taxed at 18%. Now GST is a regressive tax and it impacts both the rich and the poor alike. So the article highlights that most of the goods and services which are taxed currently at 18% should be reduced to 12% in order to again boost the consumption expenditure. Further, the article mentions that even the GST Council should think on decreasing the GST tax rates in order to promote consumption expenditure in the economy. Thus, these are the highlights with respect to streamlining of GDP. So this article has provided certain suggestions with respect to solving crisis in the NBFC sector, certain suggestions with respect to boosting consumption expenditure, that is by decreasing income tax and corporate tax, and also to streamline GST and also to reduce some of the existing GST rates. So with this, let's move on to our next news discussion. Now the next article appears on page number 10. It says, why the integrity of data matters. The merger of NSSO into Central Statistics Office is a cause for concern. Now this article highlights some of the concerns with respect to the recent Government of India's decision with respect to merging of Central Statistics Office as well as National Sample Survey Office into a National Statistical Office. So in this discussion, let us understand about the background to this merger, rationale for such a merger, concerns with respect to related merger of CSO and NSSO, and also a way forward with respect to the merging of CSO and NSSO. Now this topic of National Statistical Office becomes a part of Indian economy in your prelims examination, and your mains gets covered under GS paper 3 under issues pertaining to Indian economy. Now in the year 2000, a committee headed by former RBI Governor C. Ranga Rajan had suggested to create two bodies under the Ministry of Statistics and Programme Implementation. The bodies suggested to be created was National Statistical Office as well as National Statistical Commission. Now as per the recommendation of the Ranga Rajan Committee, the National Statistical Office was to be created by merging the existing National Sample Survey Office and the Central Statistical Office. So currently the Ministry of Statistics and Programme Implementation has passed an order to merge Central Statistics Office and National Sample Survey Office into the National Statistical Office. Now the National Sample Survey Office, that is NSSO, is headed by a Director General and is responsible for conduct of large-scale sample surveys in diverse fields of all India basis. As for the surveys, data is collected through nationwide household surveys on various socio-economic parameters. Further, it says that NSSO also collects data on rural and urban prices and plays a significant role in the improvement of crop statistics through supervision of the area enumeration and also through crop estimation surveys of state agencies. Now, National Statistical Commission was created through a government resolution on 1st June 2005, and the National Statistical Commission was constituted on the recommendations of Rangarajan Commission, which reviewed Indian statistical system in the year 2001. The National Statistical Commission was constituted with a mandate to evolve policies, priorities, as well as standards in statistical matters. The NSC has 4 members besides a chairperson, and each have their own specialization and experience in specified statistical fields. Whereas the Central Statistics Office coordinates the statistical activities in the country and evolves statistical standards, and the CSO is headed by a Director General. So these are some of the basic facts with respect to National Sample Survey Office, National Statistical Commission, as well as Central Statistics Office. Now, the Rangarajan Committee of 2000 had mentioned that the National Statistical Office should work as an executive wing of the government in the field of statistics and should act as per the policies as well as priorities laid down by the National Statistical Commission. So, based on the recommendation of the Rangarajan Committee, the National Statistical Commission was established in the year 2005. And this commission was established as a non-statutory body, as we have seen that it was established through a government resolution. Now, this commission was set up as a nodal agency and an empowered body with respect to all core statistical activities in India. And the commission was also given supervisory powers over the National Sample Survey Office. So, as per the suggestions of the Rangarajan Committee, only the National Statistical Commission was established, but the National Statistical Office was not established then. So, based on the recommendation of the Rangarajan Committee, the government has now merged National Sample Survey Office and CSO to form National Statistical Office. Further, let us also understand the rationale for the merger of National Sample Survey Office and Central Statistical Office. Now, the first rationale is that both NSSO and CSO functions under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. Now, both NSSO and CSO have similar role to play but focus on different metrics. Now, some of the important surveys and indices published by CSO includes the GDP growth estimates, Consumer Price Index, that is CPI, Index of Industrial Production, IIP, Annual Survey of Industries, whereas some of the important works done by NSSO includes periodic survey with respect to consumption expenditure, employment, land holdings, rural savings, investments, etc. And both NSSO and CSO have been functioning independently. So in this regard, merger of CSO and NSSO would eliminate duplication, activate synergies which will effectively lead to improved efficiency in their working. So these can be said to be the rationale with respect to merger of NSSO and CSO. Now, as per the order of the government, the NSSO and CSO are to be merged into National Statistical Office, and the Secretary of the MOSPI will be assisted by 3 Director Generals. However, the order of the government did not specifically or explicitly say that NSO will function under the National Statistical Commission or NSC. So the critics have argued that the National Statistical Commission will not be able to exercise independent oversight mechanism over the National Statistical Office. Hence, functioning of both NSC, that is National Statistical Commission, as well as National Statistical Office will be hampered in some way or the other. Now recently, both NSSO and NSC were in news with respect to periodic labor force survey report which had highlighted that unemployment rate in India has increased to 6.1%, which is considered to be the highest in the last 45 years. Now this news came into controversy because the government had stalled the report even though the report was sanctioned by the NSC, that is National Statistical Commission. And this subsequently led to the resignation of 2 members of NSC, that is National Statistical Commission. So the concerns highlighted by the critics is that the government is undermining the National Statistical Commission as it has kept the newly created National Statistical Office outside the purview of National Statistical Commission. Now, this move of the government, where it has kept NSO outside the purview of NSE, raises serious questions about the independence of the process through which official data is collected as well as published. Thus, with respect to way forward, it can be said that there is a need to ensure credibility of the Indian statistical system, and this can be done by ensuring that the survey conducted by the newly constituted NSO does not need prior approval of the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. Further, the NSO needs to work independently and remain outside political influence. Now, this becomes an important concern, specifically with respect to government control over its agencies. So, in this aspect, independence of NSO can be ensured by bringing the NSO under the NSC. Now we know that National Statistical Commission was constituted through a government resolution. So, in order to provide more power to NSC, it must be re-established as a statutory body through an act passed by the Parliament. Further, in order to have independence with respect to the functioning of NSO, it also needs to have sufficient budgetary allocation and adequate number of trained field staff in order to improve the quality of surveys as well as in order to improve the quality of data collection. So, on an ending note, it must be said that the newly created NSO must command the same respect as commanded by National Sample Survey Office, as it highlights that NSSO surveys command wide respect among academicians, state governments, and even NGOs, as data collected by NSSO surveys are considered to be the most reliable data, and this data becomes the basis for discussions in public policy arena. So, NSSO has achieved the credibility of professionalism, independence, and integrity. And in this aspect, it is hoped that the newly created NSO also functions in the same manner with respect to professionalism, independence, and integrity. Thus, this article, which highlights the merger of CSO and NSSO, becomes extremely important both from our prelims as well as from our mains perspective. With this, let's move on to our next news discussion. The next news appears on page number 14. It says, India removed from currency monitoring list of the United States. Now, this news highlights that the United States has removed India from its currency monitoring list of major trading partners. Now, this topic in your prelims examination forms a part of Indian economy. So, as per this report of United States on macroeconomic and foreign exchange policies of major trading partners of the United States, it highlights that both India as well as Switzerland has been removed from the currency monitoring list of major trading partners. Now, the report says that certain steps taken by the New Delhi government has addressed some of the major concerns of the United States, as India has registered a significant bilateral surplus with United States for its two consecutive reports. Further, the report mentions that India also maintains ample reserves as per the IMF merits for reserve adequacy. Now, United States monitors currency manipulation by different countries, and on the basis of manipulation done by different countries or market intervention done by the central bank of different countries, it puts a particular country in the monitoring list. So, this report highlights that both India and Switzerland did not engage in much market intervention for their currency manipulation, as there was a notable decline in 2018 in the sale and frequency of foreign exchange purchases. So, these can be said to be some of the highlights with respect to the fact that India has been removed from the currency monitoring list of United States. Now, it's important to note that India for the first time was placed by the US in its currency monitoring list of countries in May 2018 with potentially questionable foreign exchange policies. And India was placed in the list along with 5 other countries, namely China, Germany, Japan, South Korea, and Switzerland. So now India and Switzerland have been removed from that currency monitoring list of the United States. So in this news discussion, you must remember that India and Switzerland have been removed from the currency monitoring list of the United States. With this, let's move on to our next news discussion. The next news appears on page number 4. The news reads, Center to roll out targeted drug demand reduction program. Over 100 districts identified for implementation, and deadline for application has been extended till 15 June. Now, this topic of targeted drug demand reduction program by the central government falls in social development and sustainable development in your prelims examination, and your mains gets covered under GS paper 2 specifically with respect to welfare schemes for vulnerable sections, including social sector initiatives such as health. So, this news highlights that the central government has decided to roll out a targeted drug demand reduction program in 127 districts of India. It says that the program is a part of National Action Plan for Drug Demand Reduction 2019-20, and this is an annual plan. And this plan was announced by the Union Social Justice and Empowerment Ministry in February 2019. Further, these high risk areas of 127 districts have been identified with the help of NGOs who are already working in the field along with the ministry officials. Further, the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment has invited NGOs to apply to work on this particular program, that is National Action Plan for Drug Demand Reduction 1920. Now, we have already mentioned that this National Action Plan for Drug Demand Reduction of 2019-20 is an annual plan of this particular plan, which is National Action Plan for Drug Demand Reduction of 2018-23. Now, the National Action Plan for Drug Demand Reduction for the period 2018 to 2023 has been prepared in accordance with the spirit of United Nations Conventions as well as the existing Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act of 1985 as well as the NDPS policy of 2012. This 5-year policy aims to use a multi-pronged approach in order to reduce adverse consequences of drug abuse through education, de-addiction and rehabilitation. So the three aspects which this particular program focuses is that of education, de-addiction as well as rehabilitation. The components for annual plan for drug demand reduction includes outreach and drop-in centers as well as peer-led intervention for teenagers. Now, with respect to outreach and drop-in center, it highlights that all 127 districts will have outreach and drop-in centers. Now, these outreach centers will not only provide as a space or a center for counseling, but will also provide treatment as well as rehabilitation facilities to the vulnerable youth of the society. It says that these centers shall have the provision of screening, assessment and counseling and will also provide referral and linkage to treatment and rehabilitation services for drug dependents. So basically these centers will help such vulnerable youth who are drug dependents with respect to counseling, rehabilitation facilities as well as treatment, and in the process it will also provide for screening, assessment and counseling for such youth. Now, with respect to peer-led intervention for teenagers, it involves students to students interaction and it also provides for assessing of drug use in the community so that the government can know that how much or how prevalent is the drug use in the society and thereby providing early prevention and intervention. So peer-led intervention for teenagers highlights that out of the 127 districts, 68 districts will also have community-based peer-led intervention for adolescents and teenagers. And these 68 districts will include all state capitals and union territories. Further, the peer-led intervention would involve students reaching out to their fellow students. It further highlights that the objective of peer-led intervention for teenagers is to assess drug use in the community and thereby providing early prevention and providing referrals to counseling, treatment as well as rehabilitation services. It further highlights that in each area or in each district there would be one coordinator, two trainer cum supervisors and 20 peer educators who would also be trained to handle such cases of drug abuse. So these are some of the important components with respect to National Action Plan for Drug Demand Reduction of 2019-20. Now the components for drug demand reduction for the 5-year period of 2018 to 2023 includes preventive education and awareness, capacity building programs, treatment as well as rehabilitation, setting quality standards in order to develop modules for treatment of drug addicts, focused intervention in vulnerable areas, skill development, vocational training, and livelihood support to promote meaningful livelihood activities and employment, and also to instill a sense of purpose and self esteem in individuals who are drug addicts so as to steer them away from the world of drugs. It also provides for a steering committee under the chairmanship of Secretary of Department of Social Justice and Empowerment to consider and approve proposal whenever required, and also to monitor effective implementation of National Action Plan for Drug Demand Reduction, and also establish coordination mechanism for achieving the goals and objectives as envisaged in the National Action Plan for Drug Demand Reduction of 2018 to 2023. Now, all the aspects of the components of this report has been extensively explained in the PDF. So, to go through every important aspect, please refer the PDF of this particular article. So, we understand that this particular news becomes extremely important from social perspective. Now, after our discussion, these forms your practice question for the day. What you can do is to take a pause of 5 seconds. The first question says, which of the following countries are not members of BIMSTEC? Options are Nepal, Pakistan, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and China. Now we know that Nepal, Thailand, and Sri Lanka are members of BIMSTEC. So in this, the correct option then becomes Pakistan and China. So here the correct answer is C, that is 2 and 5 only. The next question reads, consider the following statements about Shanghai Cooperation Organization (SCO). First, SCO Charter was signed in 2002 during St. Petersburg SCO Head of State meeting. Yes, this statement is correct. Second, India and Pakistan holds observer status at SCO. No, in 2017, India and Pakistan were granted the status of full member of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Hence, this statement becomes incorrect. So in this, A becomes the correct answer. Now moving on to question number 3 and question number 4. Now what you can do is to take another pause of 5 seconds. The question reads, consider the following statements about non-banking financial companies, that is NBFCs. First, NBFCs raises loan only through short-term financial instruments. No, this statement is incorrect, as NBFC raises loan through both short-term financial instrument as well as long-term financial instruments. Second, the current crisis in NBFC sector has a contagion effect, making financial institutions vulnerable at its exposure. Yes, this statement is correct, as we have already learned that the current crisis in NBFC sector has a contagion effect. So in this, the second statement becomes correct. So here the correct answer is B, that is 2 only. Moving on to question number 4, it says, consider the following statements. First, Government of India has merged NSSO and CSO to constitute National Statistical Commission. No, this statement is incorrect, as the Government of India has merged NSSO and CSO to constitute National Statistical Office and not National Statistical Commission. So the first statement becomes incorrect. Second, Rangarajan Committee suggested to create National Statistical Office and National Statistical Commission. Yes, this statement becomes correct. Third, National Statistical Commission has been constituted through an Act of Parliament. No, this again becomes incorrect, as the National Statistical Commission has been constituted through a resolution of the government. So in this, statement 1 and statement 3 becomes incorrect. So the question asking is, which of the statements given above are correct? So the correct answer here is C, that is 2 only. With this, we come to an end to discussion of today's newspaper. Let's move on to the question for the day.